Hi, this is Colin Talbot again with our series talking about how governments have responded to the crisis. Today we're going to concentrate primarily on the UK and particularly on England and English local government, and I'm really pleased to be joined by Professor Donna Hall from Manchester. Donna, would you like to introduce yourself and say something about what you're up to?
Okay, thanks very much, Colin. Thanks for the opportunity to feature on your blog. So I'm honorary professor at University of Manchester in politics. I'm also chair of the New Local Government Network, which is a think tank. I'm chair of a hospital, Bolton NHS Foundation Trust, and I'm also an advisor to Birmingham City Council. So yeah, quite a mixed bag.
Right.
Oh, and I was a chief exec for 20 years as well in local government. So most recently I was chief exec at Wigan Council, where we did the Wigan Deal, a different social contract with residents.
Oh, that sounds interesting. Right, okay, well, I thought we could just kick off with something about the general context that local government went into this crisis with, because it's pretty clear, I think, that there's been a long-term erosion of local government in terms of their powers and organisation and money. And I just wondered if you'd like to reflect on that, so that, you know, local government went into this situation with a weaker position than they'd had even 10 or 20 years ago.
Yes, I mean, going back 30, 40 years has been a whole system erosion of the power of local government. Councils used to run very often health services in their locality. They used to run water facilities and energy suppliers, and all of that has kind of been stripped back, a lot of it privatised, and separate organisation, parallel structures set up that don't have the same footprint. So it's really difficult to work, and separate commissioning functions that don't link in with local communities. So it's been a long time coming, but more recently, the last 10 years have been where local government has faced the hardest cuts and hard choices to make to serve its citizens as best as it can, particularly in the north of England, where I've been based. So we've had around half of our budgets cuts in councils in Greater Manchester in the last 10 years, literally halved. And because of the way that the funding formula has been changed initially by the coalition government, and deprivation has been removed as a factor in influencing how much government grant is given to localities. That has meant that organisations have had very different settlements over the last 10 years. So more wealthy areas have benefited from it, some of them substantially, and others in the north mainly, and in poorer areas, and some London boroughs, and in the Midlands, again, have suffered massively as a result of funding cuts and changes to the way that the money is distributed. So many councils are coming into this with their services already cut right back down to the bone.
It would be worth just mentioning something about the relationship between health and social care and care homes, and the way that's changed over the last 2 or 3 decades.
Yes. So we used to have, in councils, we used to have care homes, and care contracts were all within local government. They were all managed by the council. But over time, partly because of austerity and funding cuts, they've been outsourced. Most of them are now already out in the private sector. So that makes it much more difficult to form an integrated place-based response. Some are doing it really well, despite the way that things have been privatised. But it's been, again, because the money just hasn't been there to do things like basic things like pay people the living wage, which is what everyone should expect. Lots of our social care capacity has gone into the private sector.
Yeah, and particularly in this crisis, that's created a huge problem in social care because of the fragmentation of ownership of care homes. Is that correct?
Yes, definitely. And you see some excellent providers, and you see some who are really struggling. And you know, there's very, very variable quality. You'll see that. And you know, I think one of the things that, again, we did in Wigan was we tried to create a kind of common sense of purpose around the private sector working in the place. So we created something called an ethical home care framework, which was to try to bind people into the deal. So it was a deal for care home providers in the private market as well. But not a lot of places have done that, and it is very much a free for all in most places, despite the best efforts of local government colleagues.
Yeah, and I mean, my impression, and I've spoken and written about this already, that the response of central government in this crisis, particularly in England, has been to largely to bypass local government and use other instruments to organise things. So, I mean, the one that struck me as the most incongruous was that in collecting tests in the community, they've employed Deloitte as an accounting firm rather than using local authorities and local health services. What's your view on that?
Absolutely agree. It's become incredibly centralised since the last election. I've never seen a more blatant centralisation agenda, and it would be brilliant if it worked, but it isn't working. And what we're doing is we're creating parallel, expensive structures that are bypassing local expertise and knowledge that's there on the ground. So just an example, we've got testing and tracing happening in Greater Manchester. The tests are then driven down to Milton Keynes from Greater Manchester, driving past state-of-the-art laboratories that are there in our hospitals. So, you know, it just isn't building on what's already in the system. It's actually wasteful, and it's killing people because the test results are taking too long.
I find that particularly weird because I know that the three big testing centres they've built are in Milton Keynes, Alderley Edge, which is just south of Manchester, and Glasgow. So I find it weird they're taking it from Manchester down to Milton Keynes. Do you know what's going on there?
I've no idea. I think the lack of communication is the main thing, Colin. They're not tying it into to our local systems here in Greater Manchester. So, you know, local GPs, schools, local businesses, councils, people who could help with the contact tracing, environmental health teams, public health teams, they are the people who have the trained professionals and the kit to do this, the soft knowledge about communities and how they work. But they're being completely bypassed. So the results are some of them are being lost, which is awful, and some of them are just not going into the people who can help do the tracing. So it really is a shambolic system. I'm really hopeful that they've just taken in Dido Harding to try and help with this, and they've also brought in Tom Reardon, who's a really experienced local government chief exec from Leeds, who can hopefully help us sort out this mess and try to localise it. I mean, you've said on Twitter many times, why did we not use the Civil Contingencies Act and the powers that are vested in that act from 2004, which give power to local systems, local resilience forums, to go ahead and do the contact testing, the contact tracing and the testing, and bring it all together in the place, which is what makes perfect sense. We're never going to find the salt shaker that they found in the Bavarian canteen that prevented the spread of the disease across the whole of Bavaria. If we have Deloitte, you know, driving tests all around the country, that is not the way to do it. It's wasteful and it's dangerous.
Yeah, and also because it's centralised, it's particularly in the big labs, they've had problems. I know they've had problems at Milton Keynes with supplies and all sorts of other things because they've tried to set these things up from scratch, and not surprisingly, they've had huge teething problems with them. And it means there's no resilience built into the system, because if one big central lab collapses for some reason, then you've got nothing. Whereas if you had a distributed system, you know, if one lab runs into problems, it can be coped with. You can redistribute work elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, we were already, before this government were elected, we were already the most centralised country virtually in the world, despite our small size. So I think what's happened since then is further centralisation, which is just is incredibly frightening. Actually, I think it is frightening because the knowledge and expertise to solve issues and problems with a pandemic and with a virus which we're still finding out a lot about is in our local communities.
Yeah, I was having a look at the government's response in terms of extra resources to local authorities, which they've been making a big deal out of, all the extra money they've been giving to local government. But it struck me, you've already made the point that under the austerity regime, the way they did the funding formula took more money away from councils with large areas of deprivation. And it strikes me that the way the extra money has been put back in, well, first of all, it doesn't compensate for what's being taken out. But secondly, they've even more biased it towards better off areas, because they've done it on a simple per capita basis. And I saw some ridiculous figures where some councils that had hardly any cases at all of COVID were getting millions of extra pounds, whereas others like Barrow up in Cumbria which has got one of the highest rates of COVID deaths for a council, was only getting £700,000. So it just struck me as being very odd.
Yeah, absolutely right. And I think it's been disingenuous as well. So MHCLG made announcements that everyone would be funded for what they needed in the same way the NHS would be funded for what it needed, and then backtracked on that some weeks later. So we represent 70 councils working with their local communities up and down England at the moment in the new local government network, and we're finding councils on the edge of bankruptcy, literally on the edge of bankruptcy. They only have money to continue for a few more weeks. Particularly councils who are in the most deprived areas, who've had to put in place huge outreach provisions to try literally to feed people who are self-isolating. The government approach to the food parcels was not appropriate. It was slow, and also the contents of those food parcels weren't right. So we've seen councils having to put their own money into that, and to really reach out to the deprived communities in places like Barrow, in places like Knowsley, all across the UK really, and then to take it on a per capita basis is what they've done really with the totality of local government spending over the last 10 years. But in this instance, it's been even more blatantly unfair.
Right. There is the other side of that, though. I mean, I've seen some criticisms from care homes in the private sector saying that some councils have got the money, but they've not been passing it on to care homes, which is obviously one of the main seats of COVID deaths and the need for things like PPE and all the other extra costs that they've had to endure. I just wondered if you looked at that at all.
Yeah, we have. I mean, what we're finding is, in most cases, councils are really trying to work in partnership with their care homes, and we've seen council staff who've been unable to do their normal job, say working in a library, going to help out in a care home. So we've seen some really great examples of practical help, but I've also read about others where they haven't done that. And obviously, I think that the issue has been, because we've taken a new public management model approach to this, and we've focused on the numbers of tests, random numbers of tests and random numbers of pieces of PPE, even separating out a pair of gloves as two separate items of PPE, which is ridiculous. We've missed the whole person approach to this. We've gone down an organisational target-driven route, and we've separated out the NHS from care homes and from people. And if we'd have gone down a person and a family-centred approach, looking at the most vulnerable people in our communities, the most valuable people, we would have gone for care homes straight away. But they have been marginalised in this whole debate, unfortunately.
Yeah, I was wondering about that, about the sort of soft power role of local government, because I know they've had a lot of formal powers stripped away from them. They've had lots of organisations taken over centrally, and they've had lots of money taken away. But even so, the local government symbolically can play a big role locally. And I was struck, particularly right at the beginning of the crisis, that a lot of community action wasn't coming from local government. It was coming from other civil society organisations like churches and mosques and community associations and things, which I thought was magnificent effort. But again, I thought there were some interesting variations across local governments, where some of them seemed to be coordinating very well with civil society organisations and others not so much.
Yeah. I mean, this is something we're really advocating for in the new local government network, the concept of community power, of passing power to, well, not just passing it, but enabling it to happen. And I think increasingly the role of local government is to do that. It's to properly fund local civil society and to fund those grassroots projects that will get out to people much quicker than we can in clunky municipal local government. I mean, the first thing that came through my letterbox from anyone was from our local community centre. It wasn't from the council or anyway. It was literally the day after lockdown. We all got something hand delivered in on our street. And, that's the power of local communities. They can reach out there. They know, they have that soft intelligence and knowledge, and really clever councils were already doing that pre-COVID. So again, in Wigan, as part of the deal, we had 7 integrated neighbourhood teams incorporating schools, the police, doctors, mental health, drug and alcohol services, housing, you know, everyone and the community were right at the centre of that. So you had that intelligence, you know, not just through algorithms, but through community knowledge. And really buying into that community knowledge is key for the next stage, I think, Colin, as we rebuild hopefully a better society.
Well, yeah, I was just to come on to that as a final issue, really, which is anything really going to change? I mean, my experience in the past and looking at the history of this is every time we've had a national crisis of any sort, there's been a tendency in the UK for government to centralise things around itself in Whitehall and Westminster. And then after the crisis is over, things don't go back to the status quo before the crisis. A lot of things remain centralised, and some people are saying, oh, well, this is going to be a big opportunity to decentralise and re-establish local government as the real hub of local public services. Do you think that's going to happen?
No, not yet. I'm not convinced, I'll be honest. I think, as you said, localities have been ignored as a result of, you know, as part of this pandemic, and people have lost out massively by not connecting the central framework with the local expertise, knowledge and capacity. And with it, not only that, but it's been duplicated very expensively with multi-billion pound contracts, which have not been put out to tender because the Coronavirus Act 2020 has given people massive sweeping powers. And I don't see those massive sweeping powers being removed. I think unless we go back to, you know, what is the role of a locality in delivering some of this stuff, we are going to massively lose out as a nation. And that's why it's much more effectively working in Scotland and much more effectively working in Ireland and Wales, because they have embraced the power of communities and the power of local government within the place. So, you know, that's really we've missed a massive trick here. I think what would be great is some of the work that you and others are really pushing for, which is a revision of looking at the welfare state. You know, Hilary Cottam's work on radical help and a revised role for the welfare state, building on local expertise is really what we need to do as part of the next phase of our recovery.
Yeah, I agree. Well, we'll see how that goes. And thanks very much for joining me today. And it's been really interesting. I'm sure we'll continue this conversation in the future. Thanks very much.
Fantastic. Take care, Colin. Thank you.
You too. Bye.